So I think most jazz students today use some form of play-along. Certainly a lot of people watching this channel I think will use jazz play-alongs for practice. So what I want to do today is sort of combine a series of questions about them. You know, are play-alongs good? Are they bad? What are they good for? What are they bad for? What can we use them for? What specific use cases where they can improve our playing? Questions like that. And I want to couple this to a review of the product Quartet, relatively new piece of software which provides really good quality play-alongs for jazz students. Hi everybody, welcome to Jazz Star Scrapbook. So this is a sponsored video, but I don't sponsor things I don't like, and I really like Quartet. I'm going to break this video down into two sections. First bit, I'm going to talk generally about play-alongs and the, I suppose, musical significance of using them and why we might want to use them and why we might not want to use them. And then I'm going to talk specifically about Quartet and review it in the second part of the video. I do really like this product. I'll talk about both what it's really good at and some of its limitations which affect its possible use cases as well, right? So there's going to be a rounded picture of what this app might offer you. I don't think there's ever been a point where jazz students have had more choice of tools, apps, various things to help them with their learning. It's almost overwhelming the amount of options you have now, and that's also true of play-alongs. So first of all, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the history of play-alongs, how we got here. So if we go back to the era before the 1970s, lots of jazz musicians are learning by playing along with records, both by learning the solos and also by jamming along with records. And actually there's an article by Mike Outram, great UK guitarist and educator, who talks about the way his friend Steve Brown, great drummer, played with Barry Harris and all sorts, how he learnt by playing with records and develops his feel that way. And then that brings us onto the sort of establishment of the Aebersold play-along, and then the range expands and expands to encompass most of the jazz repertoire you're likely to come across. And these play-alongs feature great musicians, including people like Ron Carter, Kenny Barron, Jimmy Rainey. These are used as a substitute for playing along with records, so a lot of musicians play along with those because of course they don't have the solos on. And then if you want to isolate instruments, you can have a limited ability to do that on the analog technology at the time. So you have the piano's on the left channel, for instance, and you can cut that out if you want. The bass is on the other channel. So they have some flexibility in how they can be used for practice. They have a good pedigree, and I think it's those real jazz performances which really give them that cachet. And that's something that Quartet can also claim as well, as we'll find out later. Then later on you get software like Band in a Box, which has more flexibility. They've worked very hard with Band in a Box to give it more of a sort of authentic feel. They use real musicians, but they also have to try and get the flexibility of those musicians, so they kind of use some clever programming to be able to chop those performances up and recombine them so you can put whatever chords in you want or anything else. I would say there's a flip side there with the naturalness of the performances. And then you have something like iReal, which I'll talk about later. Not a big fan of that, as you'll see. iReal is not really first and foremost a play-along app, but it does have functionality in that area, so a lot of people use it in that way. And then that brings us to things like Quartet. And Quartet really, I think, is quite deliberately harking back to the Aebersolds in its design, but with some modern flexibility which should be useful to students and what they expect now from software. Okay, so when it comes to play-alongs, a lot of people are quite skeptical of them, especially more professional musicians. They sort of view them as a bit of a crutch and can be a bit snotty about them. So, for instance, a play-along can be used to sort of paper over the things that aren't right about your playing. For instance, if you're not good at outlining chords in your lines, you don't make the changes, or if your time is a bit floaty and doesn't really express the rhythm of the tempo that you're playing in, then that's very easy to cover up by using a backing track, right? A backing track will make things sound finished and professional even if it's not. And if you're playing with Kenny Barron, Ron Carter, obviously it'll sound better than if you're just playing on your own or with a click, right? And the thing is that practice is not about sounding good. It's about working out the things that don't sound good and then working on those things specifically. That's different from performance. So when I'm doing a performance for this channel, for instance, I'd use a backing track, right? Because it sounds nice to have a backing track. But backing tracks are not primarily how I practice tunes. You know, very often I practice with just a metronome. Okay, so that's worth noting. So people who criticize backing tracks will often suggest that you instead practice with a metronome. And I would say that it's a very good way of developing your clock time and accuracy. So it's a really good way of developing evenness and exactness about your note placement and so on. It's a good way of learning sort of clock time, computer time, mathematical time. And this is not nothing, because in this day and age, musicians are expected to be able to record with digital audio workstations and get it exactly on it, right? The more accurate you are, the more quickly you can do session work and stuff like that. And that means that actually, yes, you do have to practice with a metronome. It's a little bit different in the 70s. And actually, if you talk to older musicians, sometimes they're quite skeptical about using the metronome. I think Chick Corea was not a fan of it. Barry Harris said he never practiced with a metronome. Jeff Berlin is famously critical of metronomes, although he's critical of a lot of things. And then you have people like Mike Longo and his student Adam Rafferty, for instance, aren't big fans. So there is a sort of counter metronome narrative, and this often points out that actual good time feel, especially with things like Stevie Wonder, classic jazz records, it really isn't metronomic. It's a human thing. And the only way to learn that human feel is to play with humans, which is where the backing tracks come in, right? Because if you're playing with an Aebersold or this app Quartet, you're playing with a human performance. And that's a way of developing human feel. Now, obviously, the best way of doing that is to play with actual human beings live. But for many students, that's not an option for various reasons. Either they don't know anybody, or maybe they don't feel confident yet enough to play with the professional musicians they need to play with to be able to develop their feel. That's also valid. You can jam with records, but obviously records have their own issues. And the great advantage of backing tracks, of course, is that they don't have the solo on top. So you can create your own solo and then record it back and then listen carefully to what you've done. So I think it has, for like real human performances that you find with Aebersold and with this app Quartet that I'm going to talk about, I think it really can offer something to your practice, especially for people who aren't getting a lot of chance to play live. On the other hand, iReal is kind of the worst of all possible worlds. It has a play along function. It's extremely functional. You put whatever tune, chords, whatever you want into it, and it will regurgitate something that sounds a bit rubbish. But people play with it anyway because they feel it's better than playing on their own. And for me, it's the worst of all possible options, because you are not working on your human feel, because the feel is generated by a computer algorithm, and the thing about swing is that it has a lot of nuances. The bass player might be ahead of the beat, the horn might be behind the beat, the drum might be playing a big dot, on the ride cymbal, but the horn player might be much straighter. There's all these elements to swing feel that make it real, and it's something you get from a human performance, but it's not something you get from, from a MIDI file printed out from a computer algorithm. And it's the same for iReal as it is for MuseScore or any of these bits of software. So that's a way of saying, please don't use iReal. Quartet will do a lot more for your playing, right? Please don't use iReal, it's terrible. Okay, so I'm going to separate this review into like pros, things that I think are really strong about it, and things that I think is worth knowing. There are more limitations than cons. I think there's something that's built into the nature of the technology, but those don't necessarily relate to things that the app is trying to be. Okay, so Quartet is the #1 jazz play-along app, I believe, at the moment in the world. And it's been out for about 3 years, so it's not super new, unlike Band in a Box, for instance, or obviously the Aebersolds. But on the other hand, it's sort of got 4 volumes now, which you can download, representing a total of over 500 possible tunes. It's featuring real musical performances by some great professional musicians in the UK, Nigel Price, loads of others. I'll put them up on the screen. These are all the real deal, and they all sound great. The app works on phones and on devices and has some limited functionality on computers. So I've got it on my modern MacBook and it works on that. So overall, I think this is a really good app. I wouldn't have agreed to do this video if I didn't think so. I want to obviously break this review down into things that I think are great about it, things that I think work really well, and then things which aren't so much cons, so much as things which are perhaps limitations of the technology and might affect and focus the way you use this app. So it's not necessarily things that are bad. This isn't an app that tries to be everything, and I think that's all to its credit. I think apps that try to be everything are usually weak in some area, you know? And I think this app is strong at what it does, and what it is basically a modern version of Aebersold, right, with some extra functionality. So first of all, the app looks great. I love the way they've really referenced the graphic design of the original Aebersold playalongs. If you've ever seen one, you'll know they've got quite striking, quite garish graphic design, which itself sort of calls back to the design of things like that, you know, Blue Note LP covers and so on and so forth. So it really channels that, and I love that, because it kind of shows you graphically what it's trying to do, and you go, oh yeah, right, this is modern Aebersold, right? I get it. Cool, lovely. So that's a really smart choice. And the graphical user interface overall is very well designed, very easy to use. There's not too many functions, which I like, but everything you need is accessible through menus or just through simple buttons, so that's really helpful. Of course, its main ace in the hole, and something which they very much are aware of, is its use of real performances. And I've talked about this obviously a few times in this video, but it can't be emphasized enough. Essentially with this, you've just got a performance of somebody comping for a tune on the piano, on, you know, playing bass, and then somebody drumming, and then somebody playing an awesome solo over the top. And you can take these and mix them most ways you want. If you pay a little bit extra, you can actually download the individual tracks and do whatever you want with them. It's all royalty free, which is fantastic, because I'm going to be using this a lot for my channel. Very easy to download these tracks, do it in seconds, and then put it in my DAW, bang, off you go. So for a creator like me, it's great. But I think one of the most powerful things about it is that ability just to get rid of the comping instrument and then practice comping with a great solo. And this is not something you get with Aebersold, because Aebersold doesn't have any solos, right? And what you're doing when you use this app is you're comping for a top professional soloist, somebody who's like at the top of the UK jazz scene, and you can just comp behind them. And that's, for someone like me who's out there gigging, that's brilliant, because I want to practice comping. Comping's the main thing that I get paid for. At least that's how I see it. So I think that's absolutely fantastic. And then you can obviously record it on your DAW, listen back, and critique yourself. So I'll be using it for that an awful lot. That's an amazing feature for me. So there is some limited flexibility. You can change tempo, you can change key. There might be some caveats about that, which I'll talk about in a second. The library of available tunes, it's over 500 tunes. I mean, more or less everything is in there that I would expect to be in there, right? There's always going to be omissions, but I imagine as they roll out more editions of Quartet, there'll be more tunes in. The search engine is really well integrated, so even though it's 4 separate downloads, actually if you just use a search feature, it might as well be one. It just takes you from one version, one installer Quartet to the other seamlessly, and it's just like using one app basically. So that's great, and that works really, really well. Right, okay, so this brings me on to what are not so much drawbacks or cons, so much as probable natural limitations to the software, which just can't be helped just because of the way it's been done. And I think you've got to remember that unlike something like Band in a Box, which has a lot of proprietary cleverness and can be used with extreme flexibility, this is basically an app which just gives you a backing track for a standard, and it represents a complete musical performance by a quartet, hence the name, and not something that can be chopped up and recombined into any format you want. And because of that, I think it sounds more natural, even though Band in a Box can sound very good. But on the other hand, obviously, there's some natural limitations involved in that. That said, one feature I would critique is the guitar chords feature. So you have the option to view the chords in different ways. For instance, you can view them as a chord chart, which for me is the most useful one. There's just the symbols there, and you just, you know, have it up there for reference. Or you can view it as piano. So you've got the keyboard in front of you and you can see the voicings. I can't speak to how good those voicings are. I don't really know piano well enough, but they are there, and maybe somebody else could comment on them. And then there's the guitar feature, and this is the feature I think I wouldn't use and wouldn't recommend using. The chord shapes that are given by this look to me to be quite algorithmically generated. They remind me a lot of the ones on MuseScore and Sibelius, which are completely useless to me. I never use them. I think I could say that no professional jazz guitarist I know, including myself, would use these particular chords, these particular chord shapes. So I think it would probably be a lot of work to fix that. They probably need to talk to someone like Nigel Price, who records on the app, and maybe ask him what he would use for a C minor ninth, for instance. I mean, it's doable, but again, it's more work. So I kind of wish that they hadn't included this feature, because I think it's might be confusing for people who don't know any better, right? But it is there, so there you go. Now, going on to the limitations of technology, so one thing I noticed is that if you transpose a tune, for instance, then it reaches a limit. So, for instance, if I wanted to transpose something like, what is this thing called Love, to the key of G, because I was doing it with a female singer, you can go one or two ways. You can either take it up or you can take it down. If you take it up, it will sound a bit tinny. If you take it down, it will sound a bit muddy. And that's just the way it is, because if a real musician was transposing that, they would change the voicings to keep them in the right register. But obviously, if you're just transposing it using computer software, then it's not going to do that. So the only way I think they could sort that is record all 500 of these blinking tunes over again in a different key. And I understand that they don't want to do that. So that is a strong limitation of this, okay? I mean, it works. It just sounds a bit weird and artificial. I think that's unavoidable. I don't think there's anything they can really do about that. Funny choice about the charts. Sometimes they omit the bass notes from slash chords. So tunes I'm thinking of where the bass notes, for me, are quite an important part of the tune, such as James by Pat Metheny, don't have the bass notes in. I find that a little bit odd. I don't know why that decision was made, but I am used to reading those as slash chords. However, without the slashes, they are probably easier to read. And if you play those chords that appear on the chart, they sound right if you're soloing. It's just that it doesn't reflect what's going on in the bass. And somewhat linked to that is, for me as a professional jazz musician, there's a fundamental limitation with it, which is that very often for tunes, I'll have a strong opinion about what the changes are for a given standard. So for something like Stella by Starlight, I'll roll my eyes if I see an A minor 7 flat 5 in a certain bar or whatever. I don't think this is a fault of the developers. I just think that a lot of musicians have very strong opinions about changes in standards. Stella by Starlight, for instance, I would choose because it's an absolute rabbit hole, like Stella. But a lot of the tunes, I would say what they've done quite well, because they have to make a choice about which changes to include, right? So what they've done quite well is they've chosen the version of the changes which you'll most often hear at something like a jam session or in a jazz educational context. And because of, those are the contexts that the people who use this app will probably most often play those songs. So it's absolutely the right choice. And then you'll have hoity-toity jazz musicians like me going like, well, actually, I don't think it's a minor 2/5 in that bar. I don't find it's diminished, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter what I think to that extent. But I think that is naturally a limitation. And what you're going to do, record Stella again with like every version of the changes that people want? No, of course they're not going to do that, and they can hardly be expected to. There's also an issue of copyright, of course. So without inflating the cost of the app massively, they've just basically said this is in the style of, for instance, All the Things You Are. So it's just the changes of All the Things You Are, not the melody. I think some of the omissions in the repertoire, so I noticed Spain by Chick Corea wasn't there, and I guess the reason why they haven't included it is because the melody is really part of the arrangement, so I don't see how you could make a chart of it without including some aspect of the melody. So there might be some omissions like that. As I say, most of the tunes that you expect to be in there are in there, and they've done a really great job of that, but that might be something to be aware of. The feel is very much set, so whatever they recorded, which is generally straight ahead modern jazz, that's the feel. I wonder if there couldn't be like a future volume of Quartet that maybe focused a little bit more on maybe manouche jazz or swing or maybe even trad jazz. That might be really popular actually, just different rhythm section style. They could do a Cuban one as well maybe, or a Brazilian bossa one. Just a thought. You know, that's areas you could go off with this app. You could have like a Brazilian version of How Insensitive with a proper Brazilian nylon strung guitarist playing it. That'd be lovely, for instance, you know. So there's a lot of natural flexibility built into this format, and all I have to do is just put out other versions of Quartet. So to conclude both strands of this video, I think first of all you should use play-alongs and records to play with humans. Don't use robo-jazz. So I think we should really focus on playing with recordings of actual human performances. Quartet gives this in a reasonably flexible form with a great repertoire of different standards that you can play on. So for that, it's absolutely invaluable, and you'll end up hearing lots of these backing tracks on my videos to come. I'm absolutely certain of it. In terms of pricing, compared to things like Band in a Box, it's quite a lot cheaper. I mean, Band in a Box can run to hundreds of dollars. And on that note, if you go to the description of this video, you'll find a download. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. I hope that was useful to you, and I'll play you out with a bit of Quartet.